And the other thing sort of on our, level setting boundaries here, are sort of putting some borders on this. Grief, like we said earlier, probably doesn't really ever end. It's just this ongoing process. And when we start taking into account how the connections, the degrees of connections we have with one another and the world around us, especially nowadays through technology, we're aware of news across the world that might be devastating. We may be grieving losses that aren't really impacting our daily lives, but which we're aware of. So you start thinking about, we're probably in some amount of grief all the time. All the more reason why it's important that we all come to some sort of thoughtful relationship with this process. And in so many ways, it's a beautiful process because it means that you love. One way you could sidestep the pain of grief is to not love anything or anyone in the first place. I really don't recommend that. But I do think it's really powerful if you can equate love with grief. You can see the relationship between the two. And in this way, grief becomes a little less obnoxious. And sometimes grief can get really obnoxious to the point where it's out of control, it's out of hand. And grieving isn't just when the grief becomes its own sort of pathology, its own illness, we call that complicated grief. And this is more common in sudden losses, in violent losses, in losses where there was no reconciliation before the death. In folks who have issues with substance use, and depression, of course, that can kick us into a more complicated grief. And the significance of noting complicated grief is that it really means you need help, usually professional help. It starts becoming the problem in of itself. It's not the way to just mark and denote and ritualize the problem or the loss. It becomes the problem. And at this point, psychotherapy and even medications can become important. So it's something to be aware of.